Go.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning into the Banff Podcast. I am your host, Mike Lafferty. Good morning to you. And today, we're talking with Mr. Ron Edwards about Champions Now. Hey Ron, it's on Kickstarter, it's been funded, it will be delivered soon. It is, Ron, forgive me if I use the phrase OSR, take on Champion/Hero System. I know that's kind of a loaded term these days.
I accept it.
Okay.
I'm old enough for it actually to count, so.
All right, cool. I mean, we're living in a post-Zack Sabbath world, so we have to acknowledge it. Might have some baggage, but all right, cool. Well, hey, we're glad to have you on. Let me introduce the rest of the roundtable, and Ron's going to tell us all about Champions Now, why it's an awesome hero system and superhero system, and why you should check it out now, faithful listener. To my left in our virtual roundtable is Walt Rebillard. How you doing, Walt?
I admit to nothing.
That's Walt doing his impersonation of a legislature under subpoena, of a congressman under subpoena. Above Walt, in my Brady Bunch grid, is Alice. How you doing, Alice?
Hi, I'm doing great.
All right, cool. And Alice is also the hostess of Babies with Knives, which is our funner, more punk rock sister podcast that you should definitely check out.
Yes, please come check us out. Discord.me/BWK.
They rock a little bit harder over there than we do here. And last but not least, our resplendent in red, we have Brandon Powers. How you doing, Brandon?
I am wonderful this morning. I am rocking the Flash and ready to get this going.
All right, cool. So, Ron, I'm sure you've had this question on at least a dozen other podcasts, but why revisit old school hero system/champions when there's, such an active fan base for the current stuff?
Right. Is this a marketing question, like a tactical strategic publishing question, or is it a me motivational background question? I can do both. Just which one do you want?
Let's get to know you, Ron. Tell me what it's all about.
Okay, numero uno. By 1980, I had thought that I was done with role-playing. And if you can judge this as you please, but at that time, I felt like the fantasy was gone. The fantasy and fantasy role-playing was pretty much drained, gone, absent. Now, I can look back and tell you places where that was incorrect, but I can also say that's how it felt at the time. So, what I did was drop it for a bit, and then at the publication of Champions 3rd edition, and having returned as well to reading Marvel Comics after a similar hiatus, at that point, I then discovered that we could do this. To really go back, I just want to put it this way. At that time, superhero role-playing was real teeny compared to fantasy role-playing. Yeah. And so because it was that teeny, anybody who did it was a total comics reader. And at that time, a lot of people had just joined in reading comics, mainly because of the new X-Men. And so, therefore, anybody coming in was either an old or a new comics reader, but they were into it. They knew what to do. That's what I guess I'm saying. You sat down to play Champions, you would know what to do. I'm getting a real bad hiss. Is anybody getting a real bad audio hiss right now?
I'm getting it. I don't know
Coming
who it's
in?
from.
Ah,
Might be from
whoever
Mike.
it's from?
Yep, it's from Mike.
Uh-huh.
I will be on
Okay.
mute then.
Excellent. So the point that I may or may not be driving at successfully here is that I have wonderful, wonderful experience with playing Champions back in 3rd edition, so roughly 1985, and I played either that or a heavily 3rd edition influenced version up through the mid-90s. And I played with multiple groups, I played with multiple people, I GM'd, I played my characters with different circumstances, all kinds of things. It was a very gender-friendly game at that time, partly due to the comics reader base at that time, so women were always involved, and a lot of different background people. By today's standards, even, it would be considered an extremely diverse experience. So to me, playing Champions was a joy, an opportunity to create comics of our own effectively in this medium with multiple people, multiple times. And in many ways, I developed most of my most notorious ideas about role-playing through playing Champions. And I will actually point to that rule system as promoting those ideas.
Bef-
So, mhm.
Before we get any further on this, though, I think that it is important for you to make a small distinction because, similarly to a lot of people, Mike was referring it to hero system / champions, and given what you're doing,
I
you're not
saw
doing
you
hero
wince
/
when he
system.
did that. Yes, Alice, Alice, I saw you, kind of say, "Oh no, we better stop Ron from blowing his top this early in the interview."
So you
I
might want
promised to be friendly about it, and at your request, let the record show. At your request, I will make this clarification. The hero system in 1985-86, when Champions Third Edition came out, was nothing but a marketing phrase. And it was very briefly referred to in the core book of the third edition. There was no hero system published, and across the books, the games published by Hero Games at that time, they were not compatible, and so they did not use the same logic. They were not about the same things, and therefore, I am talking about Champions. What I call first generation, first 3 editions, is not the hero system. And I will point to extremely substantial things that justify that point. It's not a mere technicality. You may not know that when Champions was licensed to Iron Crown Enterprises and the hero system was transformed from a gleam in the eye into an actual publication, and all of the games were rewritten to be compatible with it and each other, that was under a completely different creative team than the original authors of Champions. So this is a hard break. The shift from 3rd to 4th edition, which also is the shift from a non-existent to an existent hero system, is a very hard break. There's a big, big gulf between everything done before that and everything done after that.
Well, why don't you tell us
So-
about what the differences are?
First and
Ron,
foremost,
just
we are
off the
not
bat.
talking.
Mike,
We are not talking about a universal system.
Well,
We are not. I'll say it again.
Ron, I love it. This is very interesting stuff. I actually didn't know about this. I just have one request. Can we not foment edition wars?
No, we're not.
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
telling you about a historical fact.
Fair enough.
Nobody said a word. Did I say sucks?
Nope.
Did not.
So,
Did not.
but
Didn't-
Objection withdrawn, sir. Please continue.
Right.
but yeah, please
Now,
tell
the-
us what some of the differences are.
Right. So if I say material or an approach to play or an aesthetic or whatever was lost, you don't necessarily have to interpret that as, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket and everything since then is an abomination in the sight of the Lord. Right? I'm not saying that. I'm just talking about the fact that it was. So the qualities in question are these. One, it's not a universal system. We are not talking about something that's supposed to handle all genres, all ways. This is the super role-playing game, its subtitle. You are supposed to take it and play superheroes in a superhero team, and that's what you do. There's no mechanic in there that's suited to doing anything else.
Can you give us an
So that's
example of
one
the mechanics that prevent you from making it universal? What changes?
Well, first of all, the idea that you scale down, that you can go from the points that are associated with making a superhero and scale them down into normals, are very crude. The blocks, which is basically described as a die for 5 points, right? You guys will recognize that. To subdivide those blocks really doesn't work. So to make a distinction between somebody with an 8 strength, a 10 strength, a 12 strength, and a 15 strength, to get nuances among non-superpowered, just ordinary people, is not really suitable. The skill system is not the same as the skill system in, say, Danger International or in the Hero system. There are only 5 or 6 skills. They're all comic book skills.
Mm-hmm.
All other skills are hand-waved. They're very explicit in the rules. They mention a hypothetical superhero character who happens to be a professional photographer. They don't name anybody or give that hypothetical character a name, but we all know who they're referring to. And they say that guy doesn't have any skill on his sheet that says photography. All you did was say he's a photographer, and we are just going to take it as read that anything about photography he'll do. And we'll just use regular attribute roles to handle that if we need to. Probably not even that. So do you see what I mean? You can't build a guy. The skill system isn't there for it. The roles will be the same as pretty much anyone else at that definitional level of not a superhero. So you see, the game doesn't scale down. And if you try, you can kind of elbow it in the eye in a few places. One of the supplements has some rules for it, but they don't work very well. They just make everything laborious. You start counting, like, you start seeing things that you saw in Fantasy Hero where they really want to make these real fine nuances among people who aren't superpowered.
So
And
we're a
that's
little bit
fine.
zoomed back.
Yeah, you're a little bit
So-
zoomed out.
You mean my visual?
No.
No. In Champions Now, it's a
right,
take
right.
that's
I-
not focused in on the granularity, but more
Correct. Well,
zoomed out approach.
the grain is big. The grains are coarse. That's probably a good way to put it. It's obviously a granular system and very much about mixing and matching components, but the blocks are big and they are intended to, when they are put together, to make a different superhero from that superhero, rather than this, Night Guardsman versus that secretary. So does that help a little bit, Alice? That's one thing.
It helps very well. Yes, thank you.
There are a couple of others. There is no death rule. Dying in the original Champions was a status. The mechanics would take you to the point where you had dying status. After that, whatever.
Being that
Whatever.
it's comic book because characters don't die.
Yeah, well, or if
get
they do
revived.
die, then you say. If you do die, then you say so.
Uh-huh.
The actual nominal rule is that if anything can possibly be construed to keep the character alive, then that can happen. And I like to joke, that, okay, so there's a dog sitting next to you looking soulful as you're like lying there on the pavement, right? That's good enough. We know it's good enough. So that's another example. It's not intended to be anything but what you saw in the team books. Another is the emphasis on soap opera and situations. Now, this is going to be slightly tricky and historical. You guys probably can say just as well as me that the term disadvantages has always been a tricky one for Champions specifically. And that many of the things we call disadvantages are things that we really want to see in play, not things we don't want to see in play. Fair. And that, of course, you guys are familiar with 6th edition, in which Steve was perfectly sensible in calling them complications.
Yep.
So I actually have taken this a little further for Champions Now, but if you go back to those original rules, again, there's very, very little in there that you could construe as a somewhat more GURPS or hero system style of disadvantage, where it really is like a problem for play. And the idea is more of, we love the idea that it's a problem for the character, but it's not a problem for playing the character. It's not disadvantageous to you. So the whole idea of balancing the bad with the good, which I think is sort of a later stage way of looking at it, really isn't part of the early Champions. You embrace the disadvantages. You're like, oh boy, I got a whole bucket of this stuff. And that's why I chose to use them. I renamed them in Champions Now significantly, because I look at what we actually did. I call them situations.
So how similar is your new version of Champions Now versus the original 3rd edition of Champions?
Well, it's an interesting point. Originally, as I began working on the project and somewhat confounding the backers of the Kickstarter, rightly, I really couldn't commit to saying that I was going to be doing anything except just best practices for the existing rules. Remember, this is my sacred game. May you never be cursed with the situation of publishing or contributing to publishing your version of your sacred game, right? For all the reasons you can imagine. So I embarked on the project, not entirely certain that I was really going to change very much.
Okay.
And so I kept going, but to answer your question, I kept playing and playing. I only did it through play. Play. New group. New characters. And I broke the Kirby barrier. I shot the sacred cow. And then everything changed, and yes, the design is different. I will tell you some things that are different. One, no more derived characters or any number that isn't the direct number you use in play. So you don't have, for example, okay, I have a strength of 15, so a strength of 15 means 3d6. No, now you just have a strength of 3d6. So, for example.
That's a big change for people who are accustomed to hero system or even older champions.
However, the points are exactly the same. It's still, you get 2d6 as your base, and you have 5 points per additional d6. It's just cutting out that weird little math in the middle. And the same thing goes more drastically for dexterity, intelligence, and ego, which are now simply rated in points by their die roll. So you don't have intelligence 20. Okay, divide 20 by 5, that makes 4. So then I add 4 to 9, and that makes 13 or less. And it cost me, 10 points, because I had a base of 10, and that's 10 points to get up to 20.
Right.
We don't do that anymore at all. You just say, okay, your base is 11 or less on 3 dice.
I did notice that when we were generating characters. And by all means, your passion for this definitely comes across.
Passion, fanaticism, arrogance, intolerance. I mean, are there any other words you want to mask back there? I mean, I'm curious. So the issue here is that you're asking me about these specific changes. One of them is simply this conceptual streamlining of what you're doing with your points to get numbers that you can actually use. Mm-hmm. And Steve did something of the same in 6th edition. As you can see, he also took away things like dividing by this and then adding that and then getting your physical defense or whatever. I mean, and so it's not that much different, although mine is perhaps, as I say, I kind of shot the sacred cow in my head and I was able to go a little further with that. Mm-hmm. Few other things for people who know the system. All the physical characteristics of the toughness of your body are now collapsed into one score. There's no more constitution, it's just body. And then everything else is just a simple multiple of body. It's real straightforward. So the numbers of making your component character, speed is now in rated of 6 instead of 12, using a much simpler speed chart. And it is still a speed chart, and there are some things to point out about that. But the idea being that you can now do the points for building this aspect of your character in 5 minutes or less. It's really not very difficult to just quickly, boom, get the look of that character in those terms very quickly. I've kept the scaled down skill list. I've tweaked it a little bit so it's even simpler. Skill levels, for example, are mighty simple now. And then we can move to powers and stuff like that in a minute. Those are so nuanced and so case by case that I probably don't want to summarize them. The only thing I can say about the powers is that I really focused on this aspect of the hero, the champion's aesthetic. I don't know. I want your feedback on this one, okay? Mm-hmm. Tell me what you think of this idea, everybody. Which is that, let's take Iron Man. You can have a perfectly legit build of Iron Man with no use of the focus and no limitations that are formal, no formal limitations regarding the armor. You can do that. You can also have a perfectly legitimate build of Iron Man without the focus limitation and with a variety of limitations that are pertinent to the armor. And you can have Iron Man in which the armor is treated as a focus. 3 different builds. And what's the difference in terms of champions? It just has to do with the experience of playing Iron Man, because in each case, the armor as a special effect is still relevant. He can still take it on and off and not have it. It could still be stolen. All these things are features of the armor as special effect. This is right out of the old rules. And it's one of those things that I thought was lost. You can't, in Champions Now, say, how would you build Iron Man's armor and have an arguable best answer. It's strictly a function of whether you want the rule for focus to be in play or not.
And so here's my question. You have a guy that's playing the fringe, of all the superhero games you can get a hold of. Panels and Pages is his thing, and he encounters you and he says, why should I play your game over these? What do you tell him?
Because this game has no setting and it does not tell you what a hero is. This game has one purpose: for you and your group to make the superhero comic that you want. And you are not playing anyone else's comic. I defy you to find a single superhero game out there that doesn't treat itself as a co-author.
I don't understand the question.
I don't understand that statement.
Oh, sure. When you pick up any number of superhero games out there, it will basically inform you as to what a superhero is. And not just in the abstract, it usually has a setting. And it usually has a way of doing things about superheroing which focus it into a particular kind of superhero, historically speaking.
I disagree with that statement, having played the number of systems that I have. Supers, for one, would not fit in that unless you get a setting book specifically for Supers in one of the many supplements. But in its core, it is very much inspired by the generality of hero system. It has a lot of similarities. So that is just one example that I play a lot, but there are a number of systems out there that I would say do not share that.
All right. There are a few that I would point to that would look like that, I think, but I think I would want to argue with them in the gray zone. But I'll take that as read. This is particularly set up so that when you get started, it will form into a superhero comic that could not have been done except by the group of you for purposes of making a comic that you're going to enjoy and create as you go along. So the idea here is that the GM does not show up with a big bunch of stuff and say, this is the kind of comic we're going to play. And then you start making your character and then start vetting it against the GM's vision and get it all perfectly slotted in just right. And then you proceed. Here, it's much more, there's a process by which you go back and forth, and you will discover that you're making a comic that none of you could have done by yourself. So that's a big part of it.
Isn't that the defining characteristic of games like Fate, where it's very collaborative? Are there any elements of that?
My argument of Fate, in fact, is that it is locked down very solidly in terms of genre. That Fate, in particular, is especially stern about get it right. And that's why you have all these different aspects, and every single one of them has been carefully checked to make sure that it's going to be okay in play. There's no surprise in playing Fate. Fate is a very reassuring, comfortable, this is going to happen, this is what's going to happen. Do I like what happened? No, I spent a fate point, so now it is the way I want. And it's all very nicely colorful with all the colors that you started with. So I would say that this is a little bit different. This is much more, oh my God, that happened in comparison. There's, for example, to go back to the original again, and this is something I brought forward, you guys know that there is a certain rigidity to things like the speed chart, to things like damage, to things like endurance, to things like effects of powers. It's very, for lack of a better word, hard. You've got your numbers, you've got your dice, you've got your outcomes. Now, with those rolling, that's great because there are a couple things that come in orthogonally that hit that. One of them, most obviously, is dialogue and the subset of presence attacks, which, again, according to the original, are utterly freeform. Anybody can say anything, and a presence attack can be said. So that's a remarkable sort of the system going this way, doing this, and then this subsystem hitting from a completely different angle. So therefore, the fights and the soap operas really intersect in an interesting way. So you have that, and you also have the proactivity of player characters. This is something that is very different from a lot of the other games at the time. Who says where your character is and doing what is very often traded back and forth. Sometimes the game master's like, look, it's the next morning and you're at breakfast. Other times you're like, by the way, I'm doing this now. And there's a great deal of freedom in that you aren't going to find in a lot of other games. What I'm saying here is that Champions, and particularly Champions Now, you can be ready for anything to happen, but you cannot be prepared for it to turn out in any particular way. This is not a game where you run people through an adventure. This is not a game where you know that the climax is going to hit 2/3 way through the session. This is a game where there's a great deal of who knows what's going to happen. Relationships change because of the fights. Fights change because of the relationships.
So how mechanically do you have relationships change because of fights?
Well, first of all, the presence attack itself. I mean, the presence attack itself has very specific levels of effect. Some of them are logistic in the fight, like hesitate, stuff like that. Others are cognitive. You will consider very deeply what they says. If you can get Death School to consider very deeply that that's actually his daughter under that mask of the hero that he's fighting, then Death School's behavior will change. And so these things are fairly quantitative. And they're, as I say, they're often unpredictable because that presence attack is not limited by your speed. And so there's plenty of ways for things to turn out very differently. It's best in gaming and GMing this, be ready for anything, have no plan.
Well, that's literally how I GM most games.
Which is great. It's a common way of doing it, and that's fantastic.
That's the way I GM most games.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I'd be more than happy to participate in such a thing. There are some very interesting differences between, what's the word I would like? Very speedy improvisation just ahead of what the players are doing, as opposed to literally seeing what happens and not being in control of it. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just saying that there are lots of different ways to address this issue, and this game supports one of them. Does that help a little bit with the mechanics in question? For relationships?
Just on the way that presence attacks work, yeah. I mean, I've seen that kind of thing in some other games, and so I think I know what you're talking about on it.
Now, there's a couple of other things that are worth mentioning in terms of the mechanics, and one of them would be the psychological situations. You'll forgive me for using my jargon, situations, instead of disadvantages, limitations, and so on. Again, going back to the original, and then I think deciding where they're ambiguous which way to jump, it is notable that in this design, there is no code of any kind. There's no, I will do this, I never do that. I always do this, I never do that. I do this, I will, I won't, I do, I don't. Those are not the phrasing. The phrasings of the psychological situations are positions, emotions, and beliefs, things like that. And so what you choose to do to act on them is up to you. Even a very strongly held one, or strongly stated one, like killing is wrong, a belief, it is not considered a contractual statement from player to GM. So therefore, the psychological situations shape a great deal of play, but they aren't in the position of pre-scripting how the character is going to act in the crunch in a particular individual situation. That's one of the reasons why when I talk to people who have backgrounds with hero games and the hero system, I have to go into that. When I talk to people who don't, then I don't, because as you know, the history of the debates over the code versus killing and how that applies when it's sometimes and stuff like that is just enough to make everybody just want to go dunk their heads in the horse trough. So every table has come to their own accord with it, but it ain't going to be the same as someone else's table. So in this case, this is the approach I've taken, which again leads to a great deal of player thematic authority over what this comic is about. Only one person can say whether, only one person can say whether this was enough for summary execution to be justified. Only one person has the ability to say that relative to this superhero, and that's the person playing them. So that's one issue. I might clarify a little bit, too, that killing attacks was another sacred cow that I eventually, speaking of summary execution, dealt with. And I will say this, that by the time we get to the 90s, the way that the hero system has evolved has put playing superheroes very much into the position of many of the superheroes of the 90s. Heavily armored, bristling with weapons that all have lethal destructive power. And it is more or less given at that time in the comics that regardless of your superpowers, if somebody brandishes a pistol, oh no, that's a whole new ballgame. And so what I've done is kind of dial it back and say, look, no, guns are going to be a different rules entity, and things like guns, any of these things that are designated as life enders, are going to be a very different animal in this game than they were for that period of role-playing and that period of comics. So therefore, the killing attack, as all of you are familiar with it, doesn't exist. Is there a way to make Wolverine? Yes, there is, particularly the starting Wolverine. But there isn't a way to have somebody walk up and say, by the way, all of your powers that happen not to be tuned to killing attacks are now completely off the table because I have this power, the power to rule them all. You either have it, in which case you're much more effective and you have a defense against it, and if you don't, then you're defenseless.
Well, I find that to be, I mean, you're talking about killing attacks being one to rule them all. I find that to be, in general, it's a rock, paper, scissors with a lot of superhero games, and that's true in the fiction, is that if you bring a mentalist or a magician, that you've totally changed the field of play.
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, there's a lot of different comics to reference here and at different times. If we take the Punisher and Wolverine as excellent examples of this, all of a sudden we discover that the Punisher and Wolverine are suddenly blessed because for some reason they've got killer minds or something, are suddenly blessed with willpower that overcomes whatever. So it depends. You can point to examples that go one way. I can point to examples that go the other. So let's be careful about referencing the comics. Those characters and ones like them have been through quite a lot of different rules. So what I'm driving at is this, that rock, paper, scissors is fine if you're talking about one-hit takedowns. But if we're talking about things that are just basically, how am I going to put it, different rocks, you're going to have to go to the rock rules. You're going to have to go to the rocks, and if you want to be Wolverine who can cut through anything and, kill Ben Grimm with a slash to the heart or something, if you want to do that, then there are points. The rules are there, but the points are going to be significantly different from what you may be used to from the 15 points for a D6 of roll the body, and that's how much you do, and it goes through ordinary defenses wholesale.
So
that just doesn't happen.
So with us coming to the bottom of the podcast, can we have just a couple of quick points? Just say, like a 30-second blurb saying, this is my game, this is why it's fun, this is why you should play it.
This is a celebration of one of the most influential role-playing games in history, many of whose features are not readily apparent in the current landscape, that I've tried to bring forward. Again, that you will be able to make a superhero team comic that none of you could have done individually. It will be truly unique to your table. And it's not just a matter of checking off customizing boxes. You're going to find things that you didn't plan being unique, and you don't know where it's going to go. This is not under GM story control. This is under story creation as a group, without story points, without consensus. Everybody just plays, and we see how it goes. So therefore, it's going to be quite a ride in terms of characterization. You're going to grow with your character. You're going to be making up characters the way at roughly the power levels that superheroes have appeared initially in comics, which are very different from the fan fave versions of them. And your process of developing the character is as close as I think anybody can get in role-playing to the process of writing and drawing and creating your beloved comic as time goes by sequentially.
Cool. Alice, parting thoughts?
Well, I appreciate the crash course in how, in the throwback from Hero System 6th Edition to what was in the 80s, and I look forward to seeing more from the system.
Brandon?
Alice and I are backers on it. I'm excited to see the product and see where it might line up with our desires in a superhero game and where it might differ from them, because we, no matter what game we end up with, we can get better at that game by seeing those differences and similarities.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, it definitely has a profile of rules and philosophy of play that's going to be identifiable and useful, or usable, and then hopefully that's useful for the comparisons you're talking about. It will be, it is, not will be, it is what it is. No question at all.
And Mike, parting thoughts, and then take us out.
Well, hey, Ron, this was a very successful Kickstarter. You definitely have an excited fan base who are eager to see this when it comes out, and it looks like it's going to be coming out very soon. Do you have a release date?
Okay, I should clarify that Hero Games is the publisher and the Kickstarter runner. This is unusual for me, as I'm a publisher on my own, and so therefore I really set a huge barbed wire boundary between me as creator and author and me as publisher. So I hate to sound weaselly, but I totally have divorced my whole mind from when it comes out. They ran the Kickstarter, they're publishing it. I will tell you where we're at. Everything's done. It's in layout. I just finalized the character sheet, for example, with the layout person the other day. And so the text is grinding its way through the layout process as we speak. Cover, art, all that kind of stuff is done. They don't keep me up to date on this stuff, but I've seen a great deal of the art for it.
Awesome.
So it's all in production right now. That I can tell you.
Fantastic.
I just am not. I don't have the executive knowledge to actually give you a release date, and nobody's told me.
If you're able to find out for us, and we can get it in the description of the video.
Yeah, well, Hero Games is accessible. I mean, an official statement from them probably would be the safest.
Okay.
If it's still in layout,
I can ask.
They might just say soon if it's still in layout, because things.
I think
anybody who's been through layout. Yeah. What's that, Brandon? Sorry.
I think Christopher McLaughlin's favorite saying is "Holiday 2020" or something similar to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the biggest frustrating thing is that layout is a bear, and always goes wrong, and so it's just everybody in the creative side of it is like, oh, it's off to layout, so it's done, and then the publisher just kind of chuckles bitterly and is like, you have no idea.
It's kind of like you send the manuscript to space, and then it comes back from Pluto 2 years later, and it's ready for publication. But so this was a big success. You have an excited fan base. I've got to think there's plans for a follow-up. Can you talk about that, or is that still TBD?
That's an interesting question. Since it is not setting based, and since there's no canonical verse whatsoever, in fact, it's kind of anti-verse. So, just to be a little more troublesome, I regard the official handbook of the Marvel Universe to be one of the great abominations of publishing. And anyway, so the idea being that you make comics, and so and you find out what the heroes are because you made the comics. So the idea here, though, is that since I don't have that approach to the content, I actually would be far more, receptive to seeing it as a creative instrument. I mean, that's what this is. This is an instrument. And so, therefore, what have you done with the instrument? And we celebrate what you've done. So, in terms of publishing, or at least publicly available stuff, that's what I'd like to see, is just seeing what people do with it. Mm-hmm. And seeing these comics that I would never have made or could never have made.
So there's not really plans for a string of adventures or anything along those lines?
Not in the sense that you would think of as, the old Champions with its, well, you know what those were, right? The Enemies books and the adventures and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Those were effectively a paper trail of what people were doing with the rules. A paper trail of play, particularly back in the 80s. And so, it's conceivable that something of that could be done. The original Strikeforce publication did a beautiful job of showing this is what we got by playing. Not this is, a completed. We didn't have all this stuff when we started. We made it. And so that supplement's really, really nice about that. And that's, I suppose, again, you're not talking to the publisher, and whatever they want to put out is whatever they want to put out. Whoever they want to hire to do it is whoever they want to hire to do it. But if you're just talking about me, I look back at that original Strikeforce publication, and I'm like, that was beauty. It was inspiring. Instead of making me want to play their Aaron Alston Strikeforce, it made me want to go do it, right? Go do it myself. And he showed me how.
Fair enough.
So
how is life in Sweden today, Ron?
Well, it is now about 8 p.m. It is the end of summer, which means that it is still nice and bright out. Sun won't set till about 9 p.m. after our 20-hour daytime back in June. And it's also, I don't know just how much I want to go into this, but let's just say that the health care, the education, and a variety of other things are all doing as advertised. So it's really quite nice to be living here in lots of ways. I really enjoy it.
I was lucky enough to spend some time in Scandinavia a few different times over the years, and always really liked it. Are those IKEA shelves in your?
Oh, good Lord! Of course they are. They're either IKEA shelves or they are, some other brand that's similar enough. I just put together DVD shelves with my little IKEA drill. So, yeah.
Yeah, every once in a while I feel too good about myself, and so I like to stay humble by doing some IKEA construction.
Well, yeah, I have to say, it's once you put together your 50th shelf, then you sort of feel like maybe it'll go well this time.
Ron, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Catch you all later.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for the Vamp Podcast, and we'll catch you next time.